Welcome back to Seeing Life from a Different Angle. I thought today I would take one of the talks that we've had, or one of the things that I've talked about, and expand upon it a little bit for a few minutes. And we'll see where it takes us. I encourage you as well, anyone who's interested, to please feel free to give some feedback, any thoughts, any ideas about podcasts that you'd like me to talk about. I did get an email from a listener who had talked with me and mentioned a topic, and I am considering it and I'm processing it because I think it's something that goes very deep, especially when the topic in and of itself is a measure of hypocrisy, and so I will bring that up in the future if he's listening. What I thought I'd talk about today is something that has been running itself through my mind, and so it's really a fresh idea. And it touches upon mostly things from a psychological perspective, which I have not focused specifically on for a very long period of time. But what it basically is that it is, I believe, there is a place, a time, when, as we've talked about, when we fall out of that space of wide open reality, which is as much of a spiritual space as it is a psychological one. But in this case, we'll focus on the psychological piece. I think what ends up happening is that when we are pulled out of that space, we develop what I would refer to as the fear of abandonment. Now, it may seem strange because ultimately we're not really being abandoned. We're being taken in to some degree, to a greater degree, by our parents. The sad piece of it is, when we are taken in, it isn't always necessarily based, and rarely is it based, upon a truly healthy perspective on their parts. Not that they're consciously aware in any way that they're pulling us out of a better place to a place that is more riddled with fear and anxiety and trepidation, where, as we've talked about, we have to develop unhealthy ways to cope with life. But I do think that what it develops in the child is a sense of abandonment. It is a loss of a place of peace, a loss of a place of joy and comfort, and whether the individual is there for, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, one way or another, it is going to be a sense of a loss of that space. And I believe what ends up happening is it develops within us this fear that we are being abandoned. In other words, we are being pulled out of something. We have no way of really grasping why it is we're being pulled out. And so therefore our ego automatically makes the assumption that I'm losing something of value here. And so therefore I feel this sense of abandonment. What I was thinking about, or with the thought that I'm processing, is this. What does it do to us in that very early stage when we feel that measure of abandonment? I think what occurs is this. I think what it does is it kind of forces the ego, that part of us that helps us to deal with the world and tries to take care of us and tries in its own way to survive for itself. What it does is it kind of forces us into this action. And this action is to turn toward oneself. And with it, I think we have the dawning of one of the ego needs that we have talked about way back when, probably almost a year ago, when we talked about the 6 different ego needs. And this ego need is the erotic. Specifically, the erotic is about the sense of touch. And it is, something that can begin and can be one of the needs, and they're very few, but one of the ego needs that we can gratify by ourselves. It's not something ultimately that is as deeply gratifying that we might get from being touched from someone that we love and care about, but it is something that we can do for ourselves. And I think what ends up happening is with the fear of abandonment, the ego turns toward that need very, very quickly, towards a greater sense of physical gratification. And I think that's why it is that most of the artificial pleasures that we experience in life, whether they're drugs or alcohol or sex or masturbation or smoking, or exercise, these types of things revolve around the gratification of the body. They revolve around that sense of pleasure that the body experiences, and not necessarily pleasure in the truest sense of the word, but pleasure that comes from a reduction of tension that we experience. And I think what ends up happening is that this fear of abandonment gets eased within the psyche by these erotic gratifications, these erotic artificial pleasures. The sad piece of this is twofold. One is that it leads the individual to rely a great deal on himself, which separates him or her from others, and it serves as a point of disconnection. And the second is that it's a very lonely place to be. Not only is the individual truly alone, but they're truly lonely in that oneness, and they spend their lives pursuing this gratification to ease that tension that comes from being alone. And so I bring this up today because I think it's an interesting topic for us to consider. When something happens in our lives, invariably there's going to be response. To every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. And in this case, when we consider it, we have this reaction that our ego experiences, this way that it develops itself. And I think if we look at it more deeply and we begin to focus on how do we ease that fear of abandonment, we will end up finding greater gratification for ourselves through the connections we have with others. Be well.